The mountains of Gunnison County looked peaceful from a distance, wide stretches of evergreen forest, long quiet valleys, and the kind of silence that hides more than it reveals. But on that late summer afternoon, something felt wrong in the wind that rolled down from the peaks, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath, sensing a story that was about to take a terrible turn. Far below those ridgelines, a silver SUV crept along a dirt road. The tires cracked over stones, the engine hummed, but inside the vehicle the tension was thick enough to smother the air. Rebecca Vance sat rigid behind the wheel, her hands pale against the steering wheel. Her eyes were locked on the mountains ahead, as if they were calling to her, as if she believed they were the last safe place on earth. Beside her sat her younger sister Christine, her face drawn tight with worry. In the back seat, 14-year old Talon stared out the window, watching the world he knew disappear behind him. None of them said a word, but all three carried the same mixture of fear and twisted hope. They believed they were escaping something. They believed they were heading toward safety, but the mountains had something else in store. The truth began months earlier, in the quiet of their home, when the world outside felt unstable and stormy. Rebecca spent her nights scrolling through endless forums, reading warnings, predictions, conspiracies. She believed every headline was a sign. Every whisper of disaster was proof. The world was collapsing. People were blind, and only she saw the truth clearly. Fear consumed her until it no longer felt like fear. It felt like purpose. She convinced herself she needed to protect her family. She convinced others too. Christine, gentle and loyal, followed because she trusted Rebecca more than she trusted her own doubts. Talon followed because he thought this was just another adventure, another strange chapter in his mother's life that would eventually settle back into normal. But nothing about this trip was normal. The SUV climbed higher, the trees thickening, the air thinning. Rebecca's paranoia had grown into obsession, and she believed civilization was days away from total collapse. She told herself the mountains would shield them from the chaos. She told herself she could build a life out here. She told herself she could keep her sons safe. In reality, she was dragging them into isolation so deep they might never return. They drove past campgrounds, past the faint signs of human presence, until the road cracked into rough dirt and loose gravel. The air grew colder as the sun dipped behind the peaks. At 10,000 feet, the temperature could swing from warm to freezing between breaths. But Rebecca barely noticed. She only saw destiny. At a clearing near a cluster of silent pines, she stopped the car. The engine ticked as it cooled, its warmth fading into the mountain air. She stepped out and inhaled deeply, as if this place could wash her mind clean. Christine followed reluctantly, her shoes crunching on the dry earth. Talon climbed out slowly, studying the trees with wide eyes. The forest seemed endless, swallowing the sky and creating a shadow that stretched across their faces. This was where Rebecca decided they would live, or try to. The camp they built was painfully inadequate. A cheap gray tent from Walmart, thin sleeping bags, a few pots, cans of food, packs of ramen, hot dogs stuffed in coolers already losing their chill. Everything was mismatched, fragile, temporary. Nothing belonged in a place where winter could kill a grown man in a single night. But Rebecca believed they were chosen to endure. As they unpacked, Christine kept glancing toward the road, expecting someone to appear, to ask questions, to stop them before this went too far. But no one came. The forest stayed silent, indifferent. Talon helped set up the tent, trying to turn the moment into something normal, something that felt like the camping trips other kids took. But as the sun began to sink, a coldness crept into him that had nothing to do with the breeze. He felt the weight of the mountains pressing in, watching them, waiting for something to break. Weeks passed, summer faded, their supplies dwindled faster than they expected. The nights grew colder, sharp enough to bite through their thin layers. And the fear that once came from the outside world began to grow inside the camp instead. Talon started keeping a journal, his handwriting small and shaky as he recorded their struggles, the cold, the hunger, the strange silence that settled deeper each night. He wrote about hope because he needed to. He wrote about fear because he couldn't stop himself. He wrote about trying to stay brave for the adults who were supposed to protect him. Rebecca kept insisting they were safe, that they were doing the right thing, that everything beyond the mountains was falling apart. But the real collapse was happening right in front of her. As September bled into October, the temperature dropped dangerously. Their breath turned visible in the mornings, their food supply shrank to desperate portions, and the forest around them grew darker, colder, less forgiving. Then the first snow came. It was soft at first, drifting across the camp like a warning. But it carried a message the three of them refused to hear. Winter at 10,000 feet was not a season. It was a threat. Slowly, contact with the outside world stopped. Not by force, but by distance. By fear, by the quiet shift from survival to surrender. No messages, no updates, no sign of life beyond that thinning tent wall. Back home, their absence grew louder by the week. Calls went unanswered. Relatives exchanged worried whispers. Something felt wrong, but no one knew how wrong. In the mountains, the wind swept across the camp, erasing footprints and burying mistakes under layers of cold, white silence. And then, one night, the journal entries stopped. Far away, winter tightened its grip. In the valley below, the world moved on without them. And up on the ridge, hidden beneath the weight of snow and secrecy, 3 lives slipped deeper into the wilderness, disappearing without a sound. Months later, when the thaw finally came, something would rise from that forgotten patch of forest. Something that would draw strangers into the most horrifying discovery of the year. But for now, the mountain held its secret close, waiting, holding its breath, preparing to reveal what the snow had tried to bury. The discovery in July 2023 hung in the air like a storm that refused to break. A gray tent in the middle of a silent forest, trash scattered like forgotten warnings, 3 bodies so still they looked carved from wax. But the real story did not begin at the tent. It began months earlier, buried beneath snow, fear, and the unraveling of a family who thought they were escaping danger but walked straight into it. The investigation moved backward, peeling each layer like frost from a frozen window. And the deeper it went, the darker the truth looked. The sheriff's deputy who stood at the scene could not shake the feeling that this was more than a simple wilderness tragedy. Something about it felt orchestrated, deliberate, like a plan sealed shut long before the trio entered the mountains. In the ruined tent, the journal lay half buried beneath a collapsed sleeping bag. It was small, blue, the edges warped by moisture, but the handwriting inside was steady and young. Talon's, his words became the investigator's path into the family's final months. Each page was a slow slide from hope to desperation. Early entries spoke of excitement, a new life, a fresh start away from what his mother said was a broken world. But the tone shifted quickly. Nights grew colder. Food ran thin. The ground turned hard and unwelcoming, and the boy's optimism shriveled under the weight of a reality he never chose. Investigators pieced together the timeline. 3 people arriving at 10,000 feet with barely enough supplies for a weekend. No snowshoes, no winter clothing, no fuel beyond cheap butane canisters that sputtered out in the freezing air. The mountains did not forgive them. By late October 2022, temperatures dropped below freezing almost every night. Once the first storms arrived, their world sealed shut. The trails vanished. The cold pressed in like a living thing. Inside the tent, evidence of their struggle lay everywhere. Pots with burned ramen stuck to the bottom, a broken camp stove, packages of hot dogs frozen and fused together, the remains of snack wrappers scattered like tiny symbols of denial. it became clear the trio had not hunted, had not foraged, had not known how to. They simply waited, waited for spring, waited for rescue that would never come, waited for a collapse that only existed in Rebecca's imagination. Investigators found another clue beneath a tarp, a stack of printed conspiracy articles Rebecca had collected. Notebooks filled with her handwriting, warnings she believed were real, predictions of economic meltdown, lists of items she insisted would save them. Most of the items were never purchased. One investigator, hardened by years of seeing the worst in people, paused when he held Rebecca's notes. Her fear was almost tangible. It trembled in every frantic sentence. She wasn't a monster. She was terrified, and she dragged her family into that terror like a tide pulling them into deep water. As the autopsies progressed, the medical examiner uncovered a grim picture: starvation, severe malnutrition, signs of months without proper nourishment, and bodies that likely succumbed not in a desperate rush, but in slow surrender. But there was more. The bodies were found positioned in a way that suggested they tried to keep each other warm. A final attempt at family unity when everything else had crumbled. Still, something about the scene felt off. Too much trash, too much chaos, too little movement. It was as if they hadn't left the tent for weeks, maybe months, before they died. That detail gnawed at the sheriff. Even in the harshest winters, people try to find food, to gather wood, to move, so why didn't they? The journal offered a chilling hint. Midwinter entries were shaky. Short, almost unreadable, they described sickness, weakness, days spent lying still because standing felt impossible. A particularly heartbreaking entry mentioned Talon trying to encourage his mother and aunt, telling himself that spring was close, that help would come, that they just needed one more sunrise. He wrote about a snowstorm that lasted 5 days, a bird that froze mid-flight and fell near their tent, nights where he could hear the wind clawing at the canvas like an animal demanding to be let in. The journal ended abruptly, no final message, no goodbye. Just silence. Investigators could only guess what happened next. Most believe the trio grew too weak to function, too cold to move. They likely died in close proximity, one after another, long before the snow melted. But the injustice of it all became heavier the more the truth unfolded. Rebecca believed she was saving her family. Christine followed out of loyalty, and Talon went because he was a child who trusted the adults in his life. The sheriff knew the world they fled from never collapsed. The danger they feared never came. Their escape was built on a lie spun in Rebecca's terrified mind. Yet the greatest twist emerged weeks later. A forensic analyst examined the belongings gathered from the site. Among them was a cheap plastic bag containing receipts, worn and faded, receipts from gas stations, grocery stores, and discount shops. One of them was dated 2 days before they vanished. It showed a purchase of survival items that never made it to the camp: gloves, a winter jacket, heavy blankets. They were never found in the tent. Investigators spread out. Search teams combed the woods. Nothing. The question grew louder. Where did the missing supplies go? Did someone take them? Were they lost? Or was someone else involved before the family reached the mountains? A hiker came forward with a strange report. Months earlier, he had seen a small campsite miles from the death site, a fire ring, discarded food wrappers, boot prints he described as small, like a teenager's. Searchers returned to the location and found what the hiker had not. Buried beneath branches and snow debris was clothing that matched the lost items from the receipt: a jacket, gloves, blankets, all abandoned. Like someone had tried to use them but couldn't. Like someone had left them behind in confusion or fear. The sheriff stared at the items, a knot forming in his chest. This discovery meant the trio did not go straight to the final camp. They attempted to live elsewhere first. They moved deeper into the wilderness even as conditions worsened, and that decision, that one mysterious relocation might have sealed their fate. The chapter of their lives was shifting from tragedy to something else. Something hidden, something that suggested the final campsite wasn't part of the original plan. As the sheriff packed the evidence bags, one disturbing realization took hold. If the family abandoned their first camp, then something must have driven them away. Something they feared even more than the winter. And that question became the cliffhanger that propelled the investigation into its darkest turn. The sheriff stood over the newly uncovered evidence, the cold mountain air curling around him like a warning, a jacket, gloves, blankets, all abandoned at a previous campsite the family had never mentioned. It was the first clear sign that their journey into the wilderness was not a straight path, but a frantic series of desperate decisions. Something chased them deeper, not a person, not an animal, but an idea. Fear, the kind that grows teeth when it goes unchecked. Investigators needed answers, and they found them not in the forest, but in Rebecca's notebooks collected from the tent. Pages filled with frantic handwriting, predictions of financial collapse, warnings of poisoned water, staged riots, and military roundups she believed were imminent. Then one entry stood out. It described someone she was certain was following them. She mentioned headlights appearing in her rear-view mirror for miles, a car she believed was surveilling them, signs she interpreted as coded messages, but investigators confirmed something heartbreaking. The car she saw belonged to a local family traveling home. The so-called signs were highway maintenance markings. The surveillance was only her growing paranoia tightening its grip. Her fear pushed the trio to leave their first campsite and go even deeper into the wilderness where they would have no chance of rescue. The relocation was not strategic survival. It was psychological escape, a second flight from a danger she invented. This realization hit the sheriff harder than he expected. He had seen tragedy, he had seen neglect, but he had never seen fear turn into a weapon this powerful. Still, one piece of the story remained unanswered: the bodies. The medical examiner released the final findings. It was not immediate exposure that killed them, not a sudden storm, not an accident. It was starvation and hypothermia working together in a slow, merciless spiral. The trio likely spent weeks lying side by side, unable to stand, unable to walk, barely able to speak. The cold drained their strength. The lack of food hollowed their bodies. Their world shrank to the thin fabric of a tent and the relentless winter pressing against it. Yet even in death, their positions revealed something deeply human. All three had attempted to keep one another warm. Their bodies leaned inward, forming a circle of collapsing hope. A family bound together not by survival instincts, but by love that could not save them. The sheriff closed the file and felt the weight of it settle into him. The truth was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy of loyalty. A mother who feared the world too much. A sister who trusted too willingly. A child who followed because children always do. And their final months played out with no villain in the shadows, no predator lurking in the trees, no conspiracy hunting them down. The only enemy was belief. Wrong, unquestioned, consuming. The irony was devastating. They fled a world they believed would collapse only to collapse in a world that could have saved them. They ran from danger straight into the arms of nature's indifference. But the story's final revelation came when investigators returned the belongings to the surviving family members. Talon's aunt, who had reported them missing, received the journal first. She opened it with shaking hands and read the last full entry. It was written on a night when temperatures dropped below zero. Talon described the cold, the hunger, his growing worry for his mother and aunt. But then he wrote something that stopped every investigator who later read it. He described a moment when he stepped outside the tent and looked at the sky. A sky bright with stars. A sky so quiet it felt unreal. And he wrote that he hoped someone would find them one day, not for rescue, but so their story would be known, not hidden, not forgotten, known, as if somewhere in him he understood that truth is the only cure for fear, as if writing it down was his way of fighting back against the darkness that had swallowed his family. That final entry became the emotional spine of the case. A boy who still held hope. A boy who believed in daylight even when the world around him had turned to night. When the sheriff finished reading it, he closed the journal softly. He realized justice in this case would not come from arrests or trials. There was no criminal to pursue, no revenge to seek. Justice would come from telling the truth, exposing how fear can poison a mind, how isolation can warp reality, how love can lead people down roads they never meant to walk. So he wrote his final report with a single goal: to make sure the world understood that the Vance family did not die because they were foolish. They died because they were misled by the one thing people trust most: someone they loved. And the investigation closed with a final, cinematic image. The tent was removed, the campsite cleared, but the forest remained quiet, almost reverent. Wind brushed through the trees, as if carrying away the last whispers of a family who came seeking safety and found something else entirely, a truth they could not escape. And in that silence, the sheriff whispered the final line of his report, a line meant for anyone who might follow the same path. Fear can take you into the wilderness, but it will never bring you home.